Hello and welcome to The Plain Truth, and this week we're going to be talking about engine failures. Joining me this week, as always, it's Captain Al. Hi, Captain Al.
Hello there, and good day to you all. I hope you're having a good day.
So engine failures is what I'd like to talk about today, but I was just interested really to know what are the procedures involved when it comes to making a decision about an engine failure. Even as a novice, I'm aware of the fact that there is redundancy in place and that planes can fly perfectly well with 3 engines, 2 engines, etc. Basically, what are the procedures?
Okay, well, you mentioned redundancy, and that's a very good starting point. If you're operating a 2-engined aeroplane, so a 757, A320, you're not going to plan to depart with one less. However, if you're on a 4-engined aeroplane, like a 747 or an A380, there is provision for a 3-engine ferry flight. So it wouldn't be with passengers on board, but you could knowingly fly it with 1 engine inoperative. So I thought we'd just cover that one whilst we were talking about redundancies, if you like. We'll contain ourselves to 2-engine aircraft, and in very simple terms, there is, on a takeoff, a decision point. It's a pre-calculated speed, and it's called V1. If an engine failure occurs before V1, you have sufficient runway ahead of you to stop without any great damage to the aeroplane. After V1, under 99.999% of the times, you won't. So you will get airborne at the rotate speed. Now, it may not necessarily be at the same speed as V1, so you might have a gap where you're too fast to stop, but too slow to fly. And it's especially so on wet runways, but I'll spare that for another time. So, sequence of events, V1, rotate. So if we've reached V1, we're going to go flying. We wait for rotate, and we pull back on the side stick of the yoke and encourage the aircraft to fly. The next critical speed is V2, which is our minimum single engine speed, and that happens pretty quickly. So that's the speed that we're going to climb away at, because that speed is the minimum speed that we want to operate the aeroplane on 1 engine, because the engines are out on the wing, there's 1 each side, and if one's not working, the aeroplane is going to yaw. So the working engine is going to try to drive the nose away from the working engine. It's going to try to spin it around like a top, which we're not going to want, because that will take us into an uncontrolled state. So the aeroplane has to be going fast enough for the forces over the rudder to counteract that yawing motion. That's the sequence of events. What we have done before we get to this point is calculate what weight we can carry on the aeroplane based on the functions of things like the runway length, the temperature, the pressure, runway surface, whether it's wet, dry, contaminated with snow, etc., etc. And that will be our maximum payload, because that effectively determines what speeds we're going to use. You can imagine that in days of old, and I'm old enough to remember them, there were quite complex tables on paper. For each runway, there would be a dry performance, a wet performance, and numerous pages for contamination, depending on whether it was slush, snow, etc., etc. And you'd go into a table and it would all be worked out for you. These days, it's all done on a computer. So that's the maths behind it. What actually happens? Well, the aeroplane is designed to be able to be flown with 1 engine inoperative. That's part of the certification process. And as long as we operate the aeroplane within the manufacturer's envelope, then the aeroplane will fly perfectly well on 1 engine. And even if we've decided to have what we call reduced thrust takeoff, in exactly the same way as in your car, when you're pulling away from stationary, you don't just sort of floor the accelerator or the gas pedal. You'll use whatever thrust or engine power is necessary. So that's what we'll do. We'll calculate a reduced thrust. So even if you've taken off with reduced thrust, there is still sufficient power out of that engine operating at reduced thrust to safely fly away from the ground. Now, there are some considerations. So, for example, if you were taking off at Manchester on runway 05, there is something called the Pennines that happen not too far away from the airport. So it's a range of hills. So you're going to need to turn away from those hills. So what we have are what are called engine failure procedures. So ordinarily, you would just climb straight ahead, because when you turn an aeroplane, the overall lift reduces, so you're not climbing at the same rate. But that's all well and good if you can outclimb the terrain or the obstacles, but if you can't, you're going to have to turn away from them. So we have, therefore, an engine fail procedure that will effectively turn you away from the hills. And that's something that remains pretty much the same for that runway, regardless of weight. So we have an option. We can obviously put the working engine into full power if we want. And if we choose to do that, maybe because we don't feel that the aeroplane is climbing at the rate that we would like, it makes you feel a bit more comfortable if it goes up faster. Or indeed, something's happened. For example, the aeroplane is actually heavier than people thought, so you're not getting the same amount of performance out of it. You can select full power. It's called TOGA, takeoff, go-around power. And obviously now you're working the engine at its maximum performance. So single engine, that use of that full power is limited to 10 minutes. Obviously, if you're still going to hit something at 10 minutes, well, then keep going, my friend. Because one thing's for certain, if the aeroplane hits something, the outcome's not good. But the manufacturers would like you to limit it to 10 minutes. Then basically, once you have got the aeroplane sufficiently away from the ground and obstacles, what you would then do is level off. You would, of course, already raise the landing gear as soon as the aeroplane started to climb, but you've got flaps and slats out, so you don't need those anymore. So you level the aeroplane off, accelerate, and retract the flaps and slats, making the wing clean. And then it's largely a case of deciding what you're going to do. Now, this is where it becomes a judgment call. Most times, you're going to go back to where you departed from. However, if you've taken off from somewhere that, say, has a short runway, somewhere like Santorini in the Greek islands, the runway is not going to be long enough because we're much heavier than we were when we landed there.
Right.
So we're going to have to go somewhere else. It also may be that you've taken off from somewhere that is particularly foggy, so you're not going to go back there. And these are all things that you will have discussed on the ground with regards to your contingency planning for such an event. So most of the time you'll go back to where you start, not always, and part of your planning process is deciding where you're going to go. You are not going to go to your planned destination unless that happens to be very, very close to you. So say, for example, if you were doing a flight from Stansted to Luton, by the time you have gone through your checklists and cleaned the aeroplane up, you might as well go to Luton as to go back to Stansted because you're just as quick. So more often than not, your destination is going to be further away. So the manufacturers will have a line that will come up in your checklist or on an electronic checklist, and it will say land as soon as possible, and it will be in red, thereby indicating that the manufacturer really would prefer you to have this aeroplane safely on the ground soon.
Right. One of the things I guess I'm sort of saying from this essentially is the engine may well have started, but you may not be aware there's a problem with it until you then try and take off. So in that scenario there, I guess it's difficult to make the call, I suppose, at that point, if it's still pulling, I guess.
Yeah, so there are lots of factors. So if we look at the engine failure itself, so there are three categories that we talk about, really. There's engine failure without damage, engine failure with damage, and an engine fire. So if we have a look at the first one, engine failure without damage. So like most cars, most modern aeroplanes have something called a FADEC, a full authority digital engine controller, or computer, depending on which book you read. And it's basically a computer that does all of the engine management, if you like. Yeah. So when you operate the thrust lever, you're not actually physically operating valves. You're sending signals to a very expensive computer that decides what it's going to do. And it has gazillions of sensors going into it.
Yeah.
And one of its jobs is to look after the engine, to protect that engine. If the computer, the FADEC, has a glitch, it might decide to shut the engine down. Now, on the Airbus, as an example, there are two identical FADECs for each engine, and they flip-flop on each start cycle. So when one is looking after the engine, the other one is sat in the background in a sort of supervisory role, so it can take over. So you've had a sort of significant glitch that's affected two computers, but that could just be an electrical thing. They do have completely independent electrical supplies, but nonetheless, we all know computers can glitch out. Mm-hmm. Or it may have been that one of the gazillions of sensors has gone rogue, and the FADEC has gone, well, I'm not quite sure what's happening with this engine, so I'll protect it. We have an engine failure with damage. So something mechanically has gone wrong with this engine.
And that's this sort of blade scenario
it can be the blades, it can be a shedding of blades. It can be a whole host of things. It could be an oil pump that's seized, so that's caused the engine to seize, if you like. It could be a myriad of things, because depending on how many stages there are to your engine, there's lots of moving parts in there. So it could be any one of those that's got an issue. And then, of course, we've got the engine fire scenario, which is the next sort of tier up. So something's gone fairly seriously wrong in the engine and it's caught fire. Now, jet engines do operate at quite high temperatures. So if you have an oil leak within the engine or something like that, it is going to catch fire because the core of the engine itself is ordinarily on fire. So,
right, yes, by definition.
They're the sort of three categories, if you like, and your course of action is very much determined on what you're presented with. But yeah, engines can just run down and stay at idle. So you might not be able to get any thrust out of it other than idle, which is kind of akin to your car going into limp mode.
Yeah.
And basically the FADEC is going, well, I'm not really happy to give you any power out of this engine, so I'll keep it running because it provides you hydraulic power, electric power, etc. And it's not classed as a shutdown, an involuntary shutdown. But let's just keep it at that, and I can keep the engine safe is what it's trying to do.
I mean, I've had a thing where my car has gone into limp mode. There's been no particular reason for it, and I've just basically pulled over at the side of the road and I've turned the ignition off. I've turned it on again and started it, and then it's been fine for another 4 weeks. And now, I mean, again, is that something that you can do in flight, if you like, restart the engine or turn it off and on again like you would a computer?
Absolutely. So if the engine has just run down and there's no evidence of damage,
or fire,
so you look at the instrument.
Like
well, obviously if it's on fire, you'll have had to have used the extinguishing system within the engine to try to put that out. And by definition, that engine is damaged if it's been on fire.
Okay, yeah.
But if it's just an engine failure without any evidence of damage, which is typically going to be just a glitch with the FADECs, because they are computers. Yeah, there is a whole section in the quick reference handbook and within the checklist that says, if no damage, attempt relight. And that's exactly what you do. You would turn the engine off and then you turn it back on, which by definition resets the FADECs, and you'll try to start it.
I'm assuming obviously you're in the air, so the other engine is working fine, so you're still making your final decisions about what you want to do next, I guess. And if that engine should relight, you would then continue with your journey as normal, essentially the instant's over, or would you then make a decision? I guess that's down to the pilot, is it, your decision as to what happens next?
So that's one of those things that we describe as the captain's broad shoulders. And on the Airbus, for which I've flown for many, many years, an engine just running down is exceptionally rare event.
Right.
So I would therefore say, right, we'll relight the engine and we will land ASAP, because this isn't something that's routine. The safest place to analyze why the engine ran down is on the ground.
Fair point.
I'm not paid enough to be a test pilot.
And I don't know how the people behind you would feel about you being a test pilot as well.
And I'm certainly not an engineer. So great that we've got the thing relit.
But you almost need more answers, don't you? It's just like,
So by relighting the engine, what you have done is you've taken away the immediate requirement to land.
Right.
So now you can start to look at things like your weight and where the most suitable place to go to would be, because effectively you're now back to a two-engine aeroplane. But you have to take into consideration the fact that a short while ago you were in a one-engine aeroplane.
Right.
So it's not just a case of, oh, well, these things happen, let's carry on.
Yeah.
That is very much a sort of commander's decision, a captain's decision. But at the end of the day, we're not paid to play God with people's lives.
No.
So,
and obviously safety is the
yes.
utmost there, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
you've got to make the decision based on the fact that, you've got to make the decision for everyone else's benefit, I suppose.
Yes. Now, I mentioned the FADEC. It is a $1 million computer, and I kid you not, the computer itself is about the size of a laptop, and it comes in a very expensive aluminium flight case. And the last time I inquired, a FADEC for an engine for an A320 was well over $1 million.
Right. Gosh, cheap then.
So I have had cause to take them on the flight deck with me to rescue another aircraft.
Right.
And when the engineers hand it over, they're basically giving you $1 million in a flight case that's not much bigger than a small carry-on board suitcase.
Wow.
And they say, don't lose it.
It's worth a lot of money.
It is.
Dear. If we could perhaps just touch on the 4-engine scenario there. So if you lose one engine, then procedures are slightly different because you've got 3 others to play with, presumably.
Yes. So this is an area that, again, comes down to a whole host of circumstances on the day, if you like. So if this was planned as a normal flight with passengers, so you're starting off with 4 engines, and there you are in the cruise for a set of reasons, you end up with 1 engine inoperative, so you're down to 3. The rules permit you to carry on to the destination. Whether you elect to do that or not is, again, down to the captain in consultation with the company, etc., etc. And there have been cases in the past where a jumbo jet from somewhere in the US has flown across the Atlantic with 1 engine inoperative. And at the end of the day, a risk assessment is done and you make your bed accordingly. The issue with that is if you were to lose a second engine on the same side that the first engine failed, you've now got 2 working engines, but they're all on one side.
Right.
So earlier on, when I talked about the controllability issues, you've now got quite a big controllability issue. That's not to say it's going to fall out of the sky. It won't. But it's a bit more of a handful than it was.
Yeah, and also, presumably the aircraft is handling very differently when you've lost one of the engines.
Well, one of the key factors is that you've halved the amount of thrust that you have. So now you are not in a position to stay flying at the same altitude that you were, assuming that you were in the cruise. Because funnily enough, if that was the case, then you just turned one off in the cruise to save some money and some fuel. So what will happen is that you'll set maximum continuous thrust on the operating engine, and obviously by inference, that engine can stay at that thrust setting indefinitely until it runs out of fuel. But the aeroplane does need to descend. So what you will do is you'll select maximum continuous thrust, maintain a airspeed, and there are a couple of different strategies as to whether you're just going to gently drift down and maintain the speed, or whether you need to avoid any sort of terrain. So if you're flying over the Himalayas or the Andes, places where there's high terrain, you might need to avoid that. But basically, with 1 engine inoperative, the aeroplane is gently going to descend because it can't stay up there because it's too heavy to, and it hasn't got enough thrust.
Wow, I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating subject, and I'm sure it's one we'll come back to at another time. But for now, Captain Al, thank you.
You're welcome.
If you'd like to watch more from our great series, then you can do that by pressing here. We've also created you a playlist with all the Plain Truth episodes, and you'll find that just here. Why not like and subscribe to our channel? That way you will be notified whenever we post our great content. Or if you've got a question that you'd like Captain Al to answer, then why not pop it in the comments box below, and you may well feature on an upcoming episode of The Plain Truth.